All rise, vous vous levez. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Bonjour. Je souhaite la bienvenue à cette dernière journée de l'audience de confirmation des charges à toutes les personnes présentes aujourd'hui dans le prétoire ainsi que dans la galerie du public. Madame la greffière, veuillez appeler l'affaire, s'il vous plaît.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. The situation in the Central African Republic 2, in the case of the prosecutor versus Alfred Yekatom and Patrice Edouard Ngaisona, case reference ICC 0114-0118, and for the record, we are in open session.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Je souhaite la bienvenue encore une fois à toutes les parties et à tous les participants, ainsi qu'aux suspects, M. Alfred Yekatom et M. Patrice Edouard Ngaisona. Voilà. Je souhaite maintenant inviter les parties et les participants à se présenter en commençant par le bureau du procureur. S'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Office of the Prosecutor is represented today by Mr. Kweku Van der Puy, Senior Trial Lawyer, Ms. Olivia Stryven, Trial Lawyer, Mr. Eric Iverson, Trial Lawyer, Mr. George Mugwanya, Appeals Counsel, Mr. Nicholas Leddy, Trial Lawyer, Mr. Pierre Belbenoit Avich, Associate Trial Lawyer, Ms. Sylvie Watcham, Assistant Trial Lawyer, Ms. Lillian Robb, Ms. Irina Galupa, Assistant Legal Officer, and Mr. Yassin Mustafa, Case Manager. I'm Fatou Bensouda, Prosecutor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la procureure. Encore une fois, je vous souhaite la bienvenue. À présent, je me tourne vers les équipes de la défense, en commençant avec l'équipe de défense de M. Yekatom. Maître, s'il vous plaît.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good mornings to my colleague. The defense of Mr. Yekatom this morning is represented by Peter Robinson, Yuqing Liu, Florent Pages Granier, Wilhelmina Whittingham, and Lena Kazier, as well as myself, Milan Dimitri.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Dimitri. À présent, je me tourne vers l'équipe de défense de M. Ngaisona. Maître, s'il vous plaît.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good morning. The defense team of Mr. Ngaisona is represented today by Ms. Antonia Dijk, Marion Carin, Barbara's not here, Sarah Pedroso, and Maxime Le Heger. I'm Mr. Knoops, I'm counsel of Mr. Ngaisona. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Knoops. À présent, c'est le tour des représentants légaux des victimes. Maître, je vous prie.
Bonjour Monsieur le Président, bonjour Madame, Monsieur le Juge. Les anciens enfants soldats sont représentés par Ludovica Vitruccio, juriste associé, et moi-même, Dimitros Souproun, conseil au bureau du Conseil public pour les victimes.
Bonjour Monsieur le Président, Madame, Monsieur le Juge. Pour les représentants légaux des victimes des autres crimes, aujourd'hui l'équipe est accompagnée de Madame Asso, Madame Grabowski, Madame Pinault et Madame Peña. And I am Paulina Massilda, conseil principal du bureau du Conseil public pour les victimes.
Bonjour Monsieur le Président, Madame le Juge, Monsieur. Pour les représentants des victimes des autres crimes, Maître Elisabeth Rabessan-Atala, du barreau de La Rochelle, Rochefort.
Merci beaucoup. Je constate que du côté du bureau du greffier, il n'y a personne pour l'instant dans la salle. C'est bien ça, voilà. De notre côté, comme vous l'aurez remarqué, la composition de la chambre préliminaire 2 est toujours la même. Elle est inchangée. Pour l'audience d'aujourd'hui, tout d'abord, la Chambre souhaite prendre note des requêtes présentées par les parties depuis la fin de la dernière session de cette audience. Il s'agit des documents numéro 363, en anglais, Yekatom Defense Request for Public Redacted Versions of Decisions, et du document numéro 375, Prosecution's Request pursuant to Regulation 35 for variation of time limit to add 2 documents to its amended list of evidence. Une fois que la Chambre aura reçu toutes les réponses aux dites requêtes, elle les traitera en temps utile. Ensuite, je rappelle que, conformément à notre emploi du temps, nous procéderons aujourd'hui avec les observations finales des parties et des participants. La Chambre a déjà reçu et analysé attentivement les conclusions écrites des parties et des participants. Ainsi, elle rappelle sa décision orale du 25 septembre 2019, dans laquelle elle avait déjà affirmé que les déclarations finales sont censées constituer des réponses spécifiques à des arguments formulés au cours de l'audience et qu'elles ne seront utiles que dans la mesure où elles apporteront de telles réponses. La Chambre incite donc les parties et les participants à ne pas s'en tenir à des déclarations générales au sujet des faits, afin de répondre spécifiquement aux allégations ayant été formulées durant cette audience. Enfin, la Chambre rappelle également que, selon l'ordonnance portant calendrier aux fins de l'audience de confirmation de charges, les parties disposent de 1 heure chacune pour présenter leur déclaration finale. Les représentants légaux des victimes disposent collectivement de 1 heure et demie. Je vais à présent donner la parole au bureau du procureur afin que ces représentants puissent procéder avec leurs observations finales. Madame la procureure, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, Madame et Monsieur le juge, permettez-moi tout d'abord de m'excuser de n'avoir pas pu être présente à l'ouverture de cette confirmation des charges et de n'avoir pas pu m'adresser alors à votre Chambre. J'étais en effet en déplacement et n'ai pas pu regagner La Haye à temps, mon vol ayant été annulé et retardé à plusieurs reprises. Je regrette cette force majeure et je saisis donc l'occasion que vous avez donnée aux parties et aux participants de prendre la parole et en clôture de cette procédure de confirmation des charges, afin de dire quelques mots. Puis je laisserai la parole à M. Kweku Van der Puy, premier substitut du procureur dans cette affaire. Monsieur le Président, Madame et Monsieur le juge, la République centrafricaine, au cours des conflits armés successifs qui l'ont traversée, a été le théâtre de crimes nombreux, répétés, dont la victime, toujours, a été la population civile centrafricaine. L'impunité, en règle générale, a toujours prévalu, les victimes n'étant pas reconnues et n'étant pas indemnisées. Après que la République centrafricaine a été une nouvelle fois meurtrie à partir de 2012 par les exactions perpétrées à grande échelle par les membres de la Seleka, ainsi que par celles commises par les anti-Balaka, une soif de justice se fait jour dans le pays, de la part des victimes, mais aussi de la population civile dans son ensemble. La justice est apparue comme un vecteur indispensable de la restauration de la paix et de la réunification de la société centrafricaine. C'est dans cette optique que la présidente de la transition, Catherine Samba-Panza, a saisi mon bureau en mai 2014 de la situation criminelle en République centrafricaine à compter du mois d'août 2012. Et c'est cette même logique qui a conduit plus tard à la création de la Cour pénale spéciale, ainsi qu'aux poursuites menées par la justice centrafricaine contre plusieurs criminels Seleka et anti-Balaka. L'action de mon bureau est complémentaire de celle de ces juridictions nationales. Je veux être clair à l'intention de la population africaine, centrafricaine. Ce sont M. Ngaïsona et Yakatom qui sont aujourd'hui dans cette salle d'audience. Mais mon bureau travaille à la poursuite de crimes commis par les différentes parties au conflit et donc par la Seleka. Permettez-moi de passer maintenant en anglais. Mr. President, I shall now continue in English. Your Honors, the case before you is one of ethnic cleansing. After the Seleka set about a rule of scorched earth and terror, targeting former Bozizé strongholds and his supporters, a counter-movement began to build within Central African Republic. Widespread atrocities drove people to defend themselves, their communities, and their families against the Seleka rule. It was also driven by a desire for vengeance and revenge against those perceived responsible for the Seleka crimes and those perceived and portrayed as traitors for having sided with them. Muslims, once neighbors, friends, family, sons and daughters of Central African Republic, were seen as collaborators, as foreigners. When President Jotoja resigned and the Seleka began its retreat, Muslim civilians in the western part of the country were left vulnerable. The anti-Balaka left them no choice, no safe place in their own country. Fueled with hatred, the anti-Balaka carried out widespread and systematic attacks against civilians in villages all across Central African Republic. They hunted down, killed, raped, and injured members of the Muslim population, including those fleeing. Muslims all over Central African Republic understood that they were the anti-Balaka target, and the anti-Balaka made all Muslims their target. In expelling the Muslim population, the anti-Balaka also pillaged and destroyed most of the mosques of the Western Central African Republic. Entire Muslim neighborhoods were razed to the ground and burnt down. The anti-Balaka's violent attacks forced the flight of Muslims within the country and to neighboring countries en masse. thousands were evacuated in humanitarian convoys, accompanied by United Nations agencies, MISCA, Sangaris, Chadian, and other forces. Even then, the anti-Balaka attacked the protected convoys. Once others fled through the bush, with many walking for weeks before reaching the border, all the while being hunted down by the anti-Balaka elements. And by March of 2014, nearly all of Bangi's Muslim residents were gone, as well as most of the Western Central African Republic's Muslim population. And by the end of 2014, 70,000 Muslim refugees had reached Chad, while 120,000 Muslim refugees had reached Cameroon. The prosecution has presented evidence of Muslim civilians born and raised in Central African Republic who had to leave everything behind. They had to leave their lives behind, and years later, most have still not been able to return to their homes and resume what is left of their lives. They do not dare to. Others remained. They stayed behind because they did not have the means to flee, or because they were too old or too weak. Parents were forced to leave their disabled children behind when carrying them because they became too exhausting. Those who stayed behind were forced into enclaves and endured the most deplorable circumstances. They were subjected to a constant climate of fear and insecurity. In the enclaves, they had limited access to the most essential facilities and commodities, including basic health care, sanitation, food, and water. Shortages of medicine and access to medical treatment, combined with unsanitary conditions, led to many deaths. Access to fresh water was limited, and poor water quality led to the proliferation of sickness and disease. Unable to live without risking death, these enclaves were described by some as an open-air prison. Mr. President, Your Honors, the nature and devastating impact of the crimes committed in this campaign of ethnic cleansing established by the evidence justifies the referral of this case to your chamber and further justifies committing Ngaisona and Yekatom to trial. As the Minister of Youth, Mr. Yekatom had authority and influence over the Christian youth. While systematically emphasizing the Christian community's victimization of Seleka crimes and atrocities, he and the other anti-Balaka key figures portrayed the Muslim population as traitors and collaborators. They equated the Seleka with Muslims, even denying the legitimacy of Central African Republic's native Muslims, who they labeled as foreigners. Mr. Ngaisona encouraged the Christian youth to take up arms. He mobilized and he coordinated them on the ground. Mr. Ngaisona played an essential role in the strategic common plan, which he helped develop and implement, organizing and coordinating anti-Balaka chiefs and comzones to transform the anti-Balaka into a force able to eventually defeat the Seleka regime. But also, and importantly, Mr. President, one capable of committing the charged crimes on the scale and the magnitude in which they were perpetrated. Although Mr. Yekatom, he was not a member of the anti-Balaka National Coordination or leadership, he was a powerful anti-Balaka commander. He and his group violently targeted the Muslim population in Bangui, Boeing, and other areas in southwestern Central African Republic. Mr. Yekatom armed and trained his group, thousands of men strong. He told his troops that the purpose of the training was so that they could kill Muslims and Selekas. None of his troops would dare disobey. They openly discussed slaughtering of the Muslim population, babies and women alike. Mr. Yekatom is held responsible for the crimes committed by his troops in areas under his control. In implementing the operational common plan, he deployed troops and commanded them in their violent targeting of the Muslim civilian population. He failed to prevent or punish the troops under his effective command or control, knowing that they were committing or about to commit crimes, these crimes. Moreover, he personally participated in attacks and ordered or committed the crimes of murder, torture, inhuman acts, cruel treatment. Mr. President, Your Honors, the prosecution has collected and submitted a wealth of evidence, more than sufficiently demonstrating substantial grounds to believe Ngaisona and Yekatom are responsible for the crimes as charged in the DCC. Mr. President, the anti-Balaka's victimization of the Muslim civilian population as charged was unprecedented in Central African Republic's history. The crimes were extremely serious, and their effects and impact are unabated to this day. Many Muslim civilians have no home to return to raise their children in, to associate with the family in Central African Republic, and many never will. Mr. President, the document containing the charges sets out the evidence that establishes substantial grounds to believe that Ngaisona and Yekatom are responsible for the crimes charged. My office, therefore, seeks the confirmation of these charges and the commitment of this case to trial. This will pave the way and make it possible eventually for all Central Africans to see justice done. Your Honors, in closing, allow me to also add that the case against Mr. Ngaisona and Mr. Yekatom is the first, but not the last, to emerge from the situation in the Central African Republic. Our work in Central African Republic continues, and our commitment to bring those responsible from both sides of the conflict to account for the atrocities that occurred remains firm. We are committed to ensuring that justice is done for the people of Central African Republic and that it is seen to be done. With your indulgence now, Mr. President, Your Honors, I will now hand over to my senior trial lawyer in this case, Mr. Kweku Van der Puy. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la procureure. Monsieur Van der Puy, à vous la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone. Just give me 1 minute to set up. Your Honors, it's my privilege to appear before you on behalf of the Office of the Prosecutor again. I think it's important to recall and underscore what this case is about and what the evidence before you shows. There are substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Ngaisona is responsible for the charged crimes. The evidence provides overwhelming proof of his criminal responsibility for their commission. He faces 111 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the anti-Balaka in 5 of CAR's 16 prefectures and in Bangui between December 2013 and December 2014. Mr. Ngaisona was the anti-Balaka's national general coordinator, a role which he assumed knowingly, purposefully, and one which placed him at the helm of a politico-military movement comprising tens of thousands of elements. His designation as the national leader of the anti-Balaka in January 2014 did not just fall from the sky. The evidence is that he was among a handful of influential individuals associated with Bozizé's regime that was involved in the group's development in 2013. This is why he came to be in a position to be the national general coordinator. Ngaisona was a key contributor to the Strategic Common Plan, which is described in the DCC, as a plan to claim or reclaim power in CAR using, among others, pre-existing self-defense groups and other individuals intent on revenge against Muslim civilians for Seleka crimes. Together with Bozizé, Mokom, members of the Anti-Balaka national leadership, and others, Ngaisona exploited and co-opted these self-defense groups in order to remove Jotodia from office and defeat the Seleka, paving the way for them to claim power. Given the well-known history of the conflicts in Central African Republic, in which serious human rights abuses have invariably occurred, the members of the Strategic Common Plan knew that these pre-existing self-defense groups were bound to commit the serious and violent crimes against the Muslim civilian population. The charged crimes were inevitable in the circumstances. Circumstances which pitted Christians against Muslims, circumstances which Ngaisona, Bozizé, Yambete, and others began laying the foundation for already as the Seleka approached Bangui in late 2012. These groups were motivated and they were primed to exact violent revenge against Muslims, perceiving them as complicit with and supportive of the Seleka. Ngaisona and the National Coordination knew this, fully aware of the inevitable consequence. That is what makes the Strategic Common Plan inherently criminal. The evidence concerning Yekatom equally provides substantial grounds to believe that he is responsible for the crimes specifically charged against him. Not only does the evidence show substantial grounds, but it comprises overwhelming proof of his responsibility for the commission of these crimes personally and by members of his Anti-Balaka group. Yekatom led some 3,000 elements who committed the crimes charged. He trained, organized, and commanded them. He and his group were tools of the Strategic Common Plan. That is, they put the plan into operation by violently targeting the Muslim civilian population in the area under his control. He and his group acted pursuant to this operational common plan in targeting the Muslim civilian population in those areas. He did this just as other anti-Balaka calm zones and groups did in the areas under their control, such as in Yaloke, Gaga, Zawa, Bosangoa, Bosimtele, Boda, Karno, Berberati, Gwen, and of course in Bangui, as the DCC alleges. Through these calm zones, although these calm zones operated under their own operational common plans, they all acted to further the strategic common plan because they shared its criminal purpose, and that criminal purpose was to violently target Muslim civilians. For his part, Mr. Yekatom is charged with 21 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I'll talk just a bit about the presentations of the parties earlier in these hearings. I found the defense oral presentations impressive. I found them interesting and in some cases creative. Their written submissions read likewise, but I think are equally unavailing. It's reassuring, though, to know that the defense has clearly understood the nature and the scope of the prosecution's case and has been able to negotiate the voluminous evidence that has been disclosed. But their arguments attend only to some of that evidence, and selectively at that. As experienced advocates, counsel has tried to focus on narrow constructs to redirect the chamber's attention away from the core issues or to cloud them. They even advanced some issues in their submissions which were not maintained by the prosecution at all. Notwithstanding this, what lies before the chamber is a vast amount of material supporting every allegation in the DCC. Although fundamentally a document of notice, the DCC references nearly 1,400 items of evidence. The prosecution has tendered a list of evidence comprising several thousand more. The defense's submissions reference a fraction of that evidence. And Ngaisona argues from this that the evidence contradicts, undermines, discredits, or even dismantles the prosecution's case or theory. Most of the items, if not all, however, were presented by the prosecution. They form a part of the prosecution's case and the evidence we present to the chamber. You'll recall the defense's references to the prosecution's own evidence, the prosecution's own witnesses. Meanwhile, the Yekatom defense claims that the prosecution's evidence lacks credibility due to ambiguity or hearsay. Their arguments are equally unavailing and unpersuasive. While the defense identifies certain inconsistencies in the evidence, it's important to remember that these are inherent to any complex undertaking in a court. Different witnesses perceive and recall things differently, particularly matters in the distant past. Rather, it is the fabricated story, that's the one where you will find that the details are in lockstep. Here, there is consistency in the big picture. That is what carries the day. The evidence taken as a whole is as you should take it, is what should guide the chamber, especially given that at this stage of the proceedings, the credibility of evidence is necessarily presumptive. For this reason, the chamber should proceed cautiously in seeking to resolve any apparent inconsistencies. The fact that the defense is able to argue their position from the evidence that we've presented shows you that we have presented and made available to the chamber and to the parties and the participants the evidence as it is, unfiltered, and this is how it should be. We are officers of the court. Our objective is to see justice done, the truth pursued regarding the charged crimes, and the chamber assisted to ensure that the court's mandate to hold to account those most responsible for crimes under the statute is discharged. The evidence underlying all of the material facts and allegations in the DCC is plain for the chamber to see and to evaluate on its own terms. And there's no need to, quote, reconstruct the facts, end quote, to borrow a phrase from Mr. Knopes in arguing his client's defense. These two men are individually charged in this case as a result of a long investigative process, which has yielded evidence establishing their roles, contributions, acts and conduct, their omissions, their words, all of which demand that they be held to account and which justify the imposition of criminal liability. That is why they're here. Mr. Ngaisona and Mr. Yekatom are responsible for the crimes in the manner described in the DCC. The evidence says so, and it says so well beyond the substantial grounds to believe threshold that applies. To be sure, they are not the only ones who are responsible for crimes committed during the conflict in CAR, on the anti-Balaka side, or any other side. They are not here because they are on one side or another side, but because the evidence demonstrates their individual criminal responsibility. I'll turn briefly to some arguments raised by the defense in their submissions. As the Yekatom defense's submissions deal largely with technical legal issues relating to specific charges, I won't address them in any detail. Our response deals with them, I think, sufficiently. While the evidentiary record is clear, as is our reliance on our previous oral submissions, the evidence tendered, and that specifically cited and discussed in the DCC, there are a few points I would like to make clear. The suggestion that the conflict comprised a religious war is something the prosecution has never argued. It is, one, inaccurate, and two, oversimplifies the DCC, the events on the ground, and ignores many complex political, social, and economic factors which contributed to it. However, what the DCC alleges is that the anti-Balaka targeted the Muslim civilian population on the basis of their national, religious, ethnic affiliation, because of their perceived collective responsibility, complicity in, or support for the Seleka. This occurred against a background of Seleka crimes and atrocities against mostly Christians and other non-Muslims. This is a fact, and it's an integral part of our case. The conflict was not a war of religion, nor does the statute require this. Muslims were not targeted because they were of the Islamic faith per se, but because their faith, ethnicity, or national origins identified them with the enemy as the Seleka's sympathizers, supporters, collaborators, and conspirators. This is absolutely discriminatory and persecutory. It is absolutely prescribed under the statute and under international law. The existence of a handful of anti-Balaka members who may have been Muslim has no legal impact on the fact that this discriminatory and persecutory policy and common purpose was carried out by the anti-Balaka as a group. Still, that the conflict was not per se a religious one does not attenuate the impact of the anti-Muslim animus that runs throughout this case. Indeed, the rhetoric, fear-mongering, and divisive messaging going back to 2012 by Bozizé and his people, including Mr. Ngaisona, was promoted, accepted, and considered normal in the anti-Balaka's ranks. The Chamber no doubt recalls two videos presented in which the anti-Balaka elements talk openly about killing Muslim babies. Quote, "Même les bébés, on les tue," end quote. If there was any question that Muslim civilians were within the contemplated scope of anti-Balaka as target and perceived as the enemy, those two videos dispel that notion. One video featured an element of Yekatom's group. You see him there in the red shirt, describing how they used smoke grenades to drive Muslims from their houses and then killed them when they ran out. He said, even the babies. You see where Yekatom is sitting? You remember how completely candid his element was in describing this. He described it openly, no hesitation about how they would kill babies. The prevalence of an anti-Balaka policy violently targeting Muslim civilians in Western CAR is not contestable. Moreover, the policy and narrative promulgated, disseminated, reiterated, and promoted by Bozizé, Ngaisona, Yekatom, Mokom, Froka, and the host of other bona fide anti-Balaka members and supporters is not in doubt on the evidence before you. It would not be even if this were a trial. That policy pervaded every aspect of the group's existence, and it went from the top to the bottom and back up. It was a policy of vengeance, payback for the perceived Muslim civilian support of an armed Seleka rebellion which victimized and terrorized the Christian population and others. It arose out of a profound sense of betrayal, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the prosecution's presentation. The wound they made in our hearts hasn't healed quite yet. You heard one anti-Balaka member say. The motive for revenge and retribution, understandable as it may be, can never justify the crimes against humanity and war crimes charged, nor can manipulating or exploiting such people to the extraordinary harm and destruction of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of civilian lives ever be a valid, justified, or legal means by which to advance one's own interests or those of a relative few to reclaim power. In Ngaisona's wealth, we addressed that in the DCC. And it is not on the basis of his wealth that he is criminally responsible for the anti-Balaka's crimes. Ngaisona did not fund, in quotes, the anti-Balaka, but he essentially contributed to the strategic common plan and to their crimes, which were committed to the crimes they committed in many and diverse ways, as set out in the DCC, including by providing money to help support his elements. His wealth, particularly in a poor country, contributed to the influence he had within the anti-Balaka from its inception. It helped gain him recognition, respect, loyalty, and provided support to members of the group and helped provide them access to means needed to promote and sustain the group's efforts and agenda. His monetary support comprises only a part of his contributions to the Strategic Common Plan. The use of his influence over the youth and others, his rhetoric and justification of the anti-Balaka's crimes, his engagement with the transition government in behalf of the group, and his coordination of the anti-Balaka itself, which he opined, in his own words, as a big responsibility. That's his interview that you see there with the CAR authorities. Conversely, his role within the group was crucial. These contributions and others, cumulatively and individually, were essential. They affected how the charged crimes were committed because they enhanced the capacity of the group to commit them. It affected the scope and the pervasiveness of the crimes and the anti-Balaka's ability to carry them out as widely and for as long as they did. That is the basis of Mr. Ngaisona's criminal responsibility. Similarly, it is not the prosecution's position that Mr. Ngaisona's close relationship with Bozizé alone renders him culpable as a member of the Strategic Common Plan. The Chamber has the evidence concerning Mr. Ngaisona's stay in Cameroon, who he was living with, who he was in contact with, who the individuals he was living with were in contact with, and what their respective relationships were with other key members of the anti-Balaka movement, its leadership, and the prospective leaders of the formalized national coordination. That evidence is set out and referenced clearly in the DCC. There is no real question that as a Bozizé political KNK partisan, a former elected official from Boirab, a known Bozizé stronghold, and a minister in Bozizé's deposed government, Ngaisona was close to the former president. There's no question of his relationship to others in the movement who were related to Bozizé. And there is no question of the relationship of those persons to other principles in the anti-Balaka movement. There's just none. As I mentioned, Mr. Ngaisona's defense has referred to the evidence proffered and the prosecution's positions as nonsense, impossible, or even that they've dismantled the prosecution's theory. That the defense has not heard of this or that in international law, or this is what was argued in the Gbagbo case, with all respect to the trial chamber in that case. This is not that case, and the facts are distinguishable. And this chamber is not bound by the trial-level decisions in that case in any event. Mr. Ngaisona's argument that there was no anti-Balaka group as such, it did not exist, is impossible on the evidence before you. You've seen numerous press communiques issued by Mr. Ngaisona, signed by him, stamped as National General Coordinator. You have before you his public statements, those of other anti-Balaka leaders, including Yekatom, conceding their involvement in the group. You have his references to the group who he coordinates, the group that he refers to when he says, when he gives an order, it's followed with immediate effect. The group of 70,000 anti-Balaka elements that he claimed he controlled. The group for whom he solicited and issued identification cards, bearing the name of the Anti-Balaka, signed by him or other principals in the national coordination, the group he proposed to the transition government to pay for their cantonment, the group that he called to his residence and to other locations, including the Hotel Azimuth in Bangui, to meet and discuss strategy, their situations, their needs, their demands, the security situation, press statements. A group of individuals, as he refers to as ses enfants, the group that he referred to as ex-Anti-Balaka, when he created his so-called political party at the end of 2014, you see the list there. The comm zones, commanders, coordinators, prefectural coordinators, regional coordinators, chiefs, some of whom he was in contact with during the commission of crimes. Here you can see a list of a number of members of the national coordination with their signatures, that group. He was in contact with comm zones and commanders during the commission of crimes, and I say this reminding the chamber that certain of the crimes that are charged in the DCC were continuing offenses. Muslims were unlawfully enclaved, under siege in several prefectures in Western Kar, not to mention their displacement and deportation. The suggestion that there was no structure in the Anti-Balaka is for those who haven't yet seen the evidence before this chamber. Besides, it defies common sense. Looking at the scope, scale, and duration of the crimes committed, the level of victimization in this case just cannot happen without organization. Even before the 14 February 2014 proposal, even before the 14 February 2014 document, a proposal was circulated indicating the members to be part of the national coordination. If you look at this document, you will see very clearly Ngaisona's name on there. It went around before he even arrived in Bangui. You'll see other individuals which will no doubt be familiar to the chamber. Ngaisona did not just drop out of the sky to lead the formalized Anti-Balaka national coordination. He was already known and trusted by its members. He should have been, given his place in its origins. The defense argues that if there was a group as such, they were impossible to control. You've already seen Ngaisona's own admissions about his control over the group, about the orders that he gives that he says are followed with immediate effect. You've seen mission orders, you've seen communications to the group barring certain members from representing the Anti-Balaka. You've seen even his expulsion of his deputy national coordinator for violating the hierarchy in a document in August 2014. The claim that he was afraid of certain members such as Angelo, who attacked his residence twice, as I understood the defense, is extraordinary. The same Angelo who was assigned to lead the Anti-Balaka military police on mission, a peace coordinator serious about stopping Anti-Balaka violence against Muslim civilians, would not have been part of anything like this. Ngaisona was, because he wasn't a peace coordinator. He was the leader of an organized politico-military group. Equally implausible is that Ngaisona never discussed the security situation with his comm zones when they were involved in a state of conflict. Your Honors, the question at this preliminary stage is whether there are substantial grounds to believe that the suspects are responsible for the crimes as charged. Are there substantial grounds to find that the material facts regarding the elements of the crimes and the modes of liability specifically alleged are met? We have done that. The evidence provides concrete and tangible proof underpinning the allegations in the DCC. The standard of proof at this stage is intended to ensure that only those persons against whom sufficiently compelling charges going beyond mere theory or suspicion have been brought are committed to trial. Whereas this chamber has before it evidence of the type, nature, and quantum befitting a trial. These comprise statements from over 100 witnesses, insiders, victims, others, videos, audio, photographs, CDR, transaction records, government documents, anti-Balaka documents, intelligence documents, public statements and admissions of the suspects themselves, open source material from reliable agencies such as the UN, media outlets, and NGOs. Taken as a whole, as you should, the evidence provides ample proof of the charged crimes and every mode of liability alleged against the suspects. Before wrapping up, I want to turn to two important notions: cumulative charging and alternative modes of liability. As you know, the DCC characterizes the same conduct as different crimes cumulatively. While Article 61(7) requires the Chamber to decline to confirm charges when the evidence does not provide substantial grounds to believe that the person committed the charged crime, it does not require that the Chamber decline confirmation when one possible legal characterization of the conduct might be preferable to another equally viable on the same evidence. Rather, Article 61(7) provides only that when the burden of proof is met, the Chamber, quote, shall, end quote, confirm the charges as presented. That is our request. Although Regulation 55 may provide a safeguard at trial where the evidence requires modification of the legal characterization of the facts confirmed by a pretrial chamber, it does not address or otherwise concern situations where the same facts could constitute more than one crime. That is, those situations warranting cumulative charging or convictions. Thus, in line with the established practice of the court's pretrial chambers on meeting the requisite evidentiary standard, this chamber should allow the prosecution to present cumulative charges at trial and defer to the trial chamber, which is the venue best placed to resolve questions concerning the concurrence of offenses. The same applies to the alternative modes of liability that are alleged. When the evidence is sufficient to sustain each of the alternative modes for the same conduct on an individual assessment, it is appropriate that the charges be confirmed with those alternatives. This allows the trial chamber, to determine which, if any, meets the burden of proof at trial, consistently with the practice of the court's pretrial chambers. And as other chambers have recognized, confirming different applicable modes of liability alternatively may reduce future trial delays and provide the defense with early notice of the different characterizations that a trial chamber may consider. I'll shortly come to an end of this presentation. The charges in this case, Your Honor, should be confirmed on the evidence that is presented. Its evaluation is not an exercise, it's real life. And it comes down to the application of reason, human experience, and common sense. This case is about these two men. It's about their individual responsibility. It's about what they did and what they didn't do. It's about whether their conduct amounts to violations of the Rome Statute. This case is not a referendum or an indictment of one side or another side of the conflict, or about what side was right or what side was wrong. It is about whether Patrice Edouard Ngaisona and Alfred Yekatom are responsible for crimes committed in this situation. The evidence says that they are. and they should face justice. Justice is a process. It doesn't always come in a convenient package. It's not always tidy or timely or neat. The facts of this case and the truth of the matter, by force of logic and reason, is that many individuals should be held to account for the vast crimes committed in the Central African Republic. And I want to be clear that the prosecution's investigation in this situation is ongoing on all sides, as Madam Prosecutor has just said. Still, the process of justice has to start somewhere, and so it begins here. This concludes our remarks, and I want to thank Mr. President, Your Honors, and everyone for your attention.
C'est merveilleux. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Van der Pouye. Je vous félicite, je félicite Madame la procureure pour nous avoir facilité la tâche. Vous avez respecté le calendrier que nous avions fixé. Encore une fois, merci beaucoup. Selon notre programme, nous allons maintenant passer aux observations des représentants légaux des victimes, parce que la défense passera en dernier. C'est bien ça. Alors, je passe la parole aux représentants légaux des victimes, s'il vous plaît, sans plus attendre.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais d'abord commencer à présenter mes déclarations au nom des anciens enfants soldats, suivis de mes consorts de l'équipe des victimes des autres crimes. Monsieur le Président, Madame, Monsieur les juges, pendant mes déclarations, je ne vais pas revenir sur tous les aspects de l'affaire. Et pour ne pas être répétitif, je me joins aux observations du bureau du procureur, présentées tant à l'oral que par écrit, pour attendre qu'il s'agisse du recrutement d'enfants de moins de 15 ans dans les rangs des anti-Balaka et de leur utilisation active à des hostilités. Et je réitère également, sans les répéter, mes déclarations présentées en début de l'audience de confirmation des charges et demande respectueusement à la Chambre de les prendre en considération en fin de votre détermination. Je me limiterai à certaines questions soulevées par la défense de M. Yekatom relatives au chef d'accusation 29 qui porte sur l'enrôlement et la conscription d'enfants de moins de 15 ans dans les rangs des anti-Balaka et leur utilisation active à des hostilités. Et ensuite, je vais faire quelques observations concernant la présentation faite par la défense de M. Ngaïsona. Tout d'abord, la défense de M. Yekatom tend à faire valoir que pour autant que le chef d'accusation 29 soit concerné, le document de notification des charges est vague et n'est pas suffisamment spécifique, tout en indiquant en particulier que, et je cite, « Dans le document contenant les charges, on ne trouve aucun élément permettant d'identifier ces 14 soi-disant enfants soldats. Il n'y a aucune indication non plus pour nous expliquer quand ils ont été enrôlés, quand ils ont participé aux hostilités, ni où cela a bien pu se faire. » Et je fais référence à la transcription de l'audience du 23 septembre, page 59, lignes 4 à 7. Premièrement, en ce qui concerne le temps et les lieux du recrutement d'enfants dans les groupes armés, je voudrais rappeler l'approche de la Chambre de première instance 1 dans l'affaire Lubanga, qui a été récemment réitérée par la Chambre de première instance 6 dans l'affaire Ntaganda. Selon cette approche, le crime d'enrôlement et de conscription d'enfants de moins de 15 ans et leur utilisation active à des hostilités étant, et je cite, « de nature continue, ces infractions ne cessent d'être commises que lorsque l'enfant atteint l'âge de 15 ans ou quitte la force ou le groupe armé. » Fin citation. Et je fais référence au jugement du 8 juillet 2019, paragraphe 1112. Dans l'affaire Ntaganda, la Chambre de première instance 6 a en outre précisé qu'au vu du caractère continu du crime en question, les charges sont considérées suffisamment étayées, même dans le cas où, et je cite, « le moment de l'enrôlement ou de la conscription peut ne pas être connu ou impossible à spécifier dans le cadre d'un chef d'accusation. » Fin de citation. Et surtout lorsque le recrutement a lieu dans un, et je cite encore, environnement coercitif institutionnalisé, dans des circonstances similaires, sur une période de temps donnée et non comme des actes isolés. Fin de citation. La référence est faite au jugement précité, paragraphe 1112. Dans le contexte de la présente affaire, le caractère systématique et élargi du recrutement d'enfants de moins de 15 ans dans les rangs des anti-Balaka et de leur utilisation active à des hostilités a été généralement reconnu et appuyé par de nombreuses sources, y compris par, si je ne m'abuse, 8 témoins cités par l'accusation, ainsi que par des rapports des Nations Unies et des organisations non gouvernementales. Et je fais encore référence au rapport du secrétaire général des Nations Unies intitulé « Le sort des enfants en temps de conflit armé en République centrafricaine » du 12 février 2016 au paragraphe 20, selon lequel, au cours de la seule année 2014, 2347 enfants soldats étaient enrôlés particulièrement dans les rangs des anti-Balaka. Eu égard à cette ampleur large du phénomène, et conformément à la jurisprudence internationale, y compris celle citée par la défense, il n'est donc même pas requis que le document de notification des charges identifie toutes les victimes concernées, puisque pratiquement cela est extrêmement difficile, voire impossible. À cet égard, je fais référence au paragraphe 23 du jugement dans l'affaire devant le TPIR, Ntageruru et les autres, du 7 juillet 2006, cité par la défense de M. Yekatom, selon lequel, et je cite en anglais, « The sheer scale of the alleged crimes makes it impracticable to require a high degree of specificity in such matters as the identity of the victims and the dates for the commission of the crimes. » Fin de citation. Je fais également référence au paragraphe 558 du jugement dans l'affaire devant le TPI Y, Sayenovic et les autres, du 23 janvier 2014, selon lequel, et je cite en anglais, « Although the identity of a victim is information that is valuable to the preparation of a defense, convictions may also be entered on unspecified victims. » Fin de citation. Par ailleurs, et puisque la défense continue à insister sur ce point dans ses écritures d'hier, l'observation de la défense, selon laquelle elle ne connaît pas l'identité des 14 enfants soldats auxquels l'accusation fait référence, est dénuée de tout fondement, puisque le document cité dans la note de bas de page 749 du document de notification des charges contient bien les listes des enfants concernés, avec leur nom complet, leur âge, leur sexe, leur lieu de retour, et même l'information sur leur famille de référence. Il suffit d'ouvrir le document. Concernant la proximité du crime à M. Yekatom, le document de notification des charges fournit de la preuve additionnelle concernant l'événement du 4 août 2014, relative aux négociations entre les ONG locales, l'UNICEF et M. Yekatom, tout en attestant que M. Yekatom en personne avait donné son accord à la démobilisation des enfants des rangs des anti-Balaka, ainsi que son accord à ne plus procéder au recrutement d'enfants. En outre, plusieurs enfants soldats étaient parmi les gardes de sa propre maison. Et enfin, et concernant toujours la question de proximité, il convient de noter que les 83 anciens enfants soldats qui participent à la présente procédure ont tous relaté dans leur demande de participation d'avoir été recrutés dans les rangs des anti-Balaka et ont tous mentionné comme auteur principal de ce crime leur commandant Rambo, et donc M. Yekatom. De plus, plusieurs de ces enfants ont relaté d'avoir été conscrits par Rambo en personne et d'avoir subi des crimes additionnels pendant leur conscription, commis par leur commandant Rambo en personne, dont des actes de traitement inhumain, mais également de violences sexuelles. Pourquoi une telle unanimité? Il s'agit d'une coïncidence ou d'un complot peut-être? Quels autres éléments devraient être apportés à ce stade pour que le document de notification des charges soit considéré, aux yeux de la défense, suffisamment spécifique et étayé? À cet égard, il convient de rappeler la jurisprudence de cette Cour, qui est constante aujourd'hui, selon laquelle, et je cite le paragraphe 40 de la décision sur la confirmation des charges, dans l'affaire Roto et 5 du 23 janvier 2012. L'audience de confirmation des charges a pour objet de s'assurer qu'aucune affaire n'est renvoyée en jugement, à moins que les éléments de preuve ne suffisent à établir qu'il y a des motifs substantiels de croire que la personne a commis les crimes qui lui sont reprochés. Ce mécanisme a été conçu pour protéger les droits de la défense contre des charges abusives et totalement infondées. Fin de citation. En outre, je cite le paragraphe 64 de la décision sur la confirmation des charges dans l'affaire Katanga, du 30 septembre 2008. L'audience de confirmation des charges a une portée et un objet limités, et qu'il ne devait pas être considéré comme un mini-procès ou un procès avant le procès. Fin de citation. Enfin, je fais référence au paragraphe 39 de la décision sur la confirmation des charges dans l'affaire Lubanga, du 29 janvier 2007, selon lequel, au stade de la confirmation des charges, l'accusation a une obligation de, et je cite, fournir des preuves concrètes et tangibles, montrant une direction claire dans le raisonnement supportant ces allégations spécifiques. Fin de citation. À cet égard, je fais référence au paragraphe 31 d'un jugement rendu dans l'affaire Al-Bashir du 3 février 2010, selon lequel, au stade préliminaire, et je cite, « Il n'est pas nécessaire d'être certain que la personne a commis l'infraction alléguée. Cette certitude n'est exigée qu'au procès, quand le procureur a eu la possibilité de présenter davantage de preuves. » Fin de citation. À la lumière de la jurisprudence de la Cour citée ci-dessus, et eu égard aux éléments de preuve présentés par l'accusation, et tenant compte de la portée limitée du stade de confirmation des charges, les affirmations de la défense selon lesquelles l'accusation n'a pas respecté le seuil de la preuve requis doivent être rejetées. En revanche, l'accusation a présenté les éléments de preuve suffisamment spécifiques afin de démontrer que le crime sous le chef d'accusation 29 a été commis aussi bien par M. Yekatom directement que par des éléments des troupes des anti-Balaka qu'il dirigeait. En tout état de cause, et conformément aux standards de la preuve applicable à ce stade, l'accusation a bien montré une direction largement claire dans le raisonnement étayant ces allégations spécifiques. Et la défense ne fait certainement pas face aux charges abusives et totalement infondées. D'ailleurs, la défense de M. Yekatom ne conteste pas la présence des enfants de moins de 15 ans dans les rangs des anti-Balaka, ni l'implication de M. Yekatom dans la démobilisation de certains de ses enfants, mais ne fait que soulever un manque d'information en sa disposition afin de pouvoir défendre M. Yekatom. Je passe maintenant brièvement à la présentation faite par la défense de M. Ngaïsona. J'avoue, Monsieur le Président, Madame, Monsieur le Juge, que lorsque j'avais écouté la présentation de la défense de M. Ngaïsona, j'avais l'impression, et apparemment pas seulement moi, que nous nous étions tous trompés du forum et que nous étions non pas à la Cour pénale internationale, en train de discuter de la responsabilité pénale de M. Ngaïsona, mais plutôt à un événement tendant à délivrer une prime d'honneur à M. Ngaïsola pour ses mérites et pour ses qualités prétendument exceptionnelles. Et ce, nonobstant l'abondance des éléments de preuve démontrant le contraire. Corrigez-moi si j'ai peut-être manqué certains passages. Pendant ces présentations, la défense de M. Ngaïsola n'avait jamais fait référence à la question du recrutement d'enfants de moins de 15 ans dans des groupes armés en République centrafricaine de façon générale et dans les rangs des anti-Balaka en particulier. C'est comme si ce phénomène extrêmement répandu, généralement reconnu, n'existait pas du tout. C'est comme tout simplement nier l'évidence. Cette omission est d'autant plus surprenante que M. Ngaïsola avait été pendant longtemps président de la Fédération centrafricaine du football et avait un rôle important dans le cadre de la coordination de la jeunesse. Et était même le ministre de la jeunesse de la République centrafricaine. Il était donc censé au moins être au courant de la problématique, eu égard à son ampleur extrêmement large. En revanche, nous avons entendu que M. Ngaïsola ne pouvait pas commettre ces crimes, lui reprochés, parce qu'il avait été très occupé en tant que président de la Fédération centrafricaine du football et avait en outre exercé une mission de porteur de paix et de réconciliation. Monsieur le Président, j'avoue que j'ai du mal à comprendre cet argument. Excusez-moi l'expression, mais on peut très bien cumuler des choses. On peut très bien diriger le football et être auteur des crimes les plus atroces sur le plan international, sans pour autant avoir même besoin d'être physiquement présent sur la scène du crime. On peut donc faire les deux choses en même temps. C'est parce que, tout simplement, l'une réalité n'exclut pas l'autre, qui peuvent très bien exister en parallèle. Et c'est aussi parce que, comme nous le savons tous, le statut de Rome prévoit explicitement la responsabilité pénale non seulement des auteurs directs des crimes, mais également de ceux qui contribuent, d'une manière ou d'une autre, à la commission des crimes, peu importe leur proximité physique. Si M. Ngaïsola, comme sa défense tente à faire valoir, n'était associé à aucun groupe anti-Balaka, je m'interroge sur la question de savoir dans quelle capacité il avait donné des instructions à un représentant des anti-Balaka de venir à la réunion consacrée à la démobilisation des enfants du groupe anti-Balaka dirigé par M. Yekatom. Aucune réponse à cette question n'a été fournie par la défense de M. Ngaïsola. Monsieur le Président, Madame, Monsieur le Juge, eu égard aux éléments de preuve contenus dans le document de notification des charges et présentés par l'accusation au cours de l'audience de confirmation des charges, les anciens enfants soldats soumettent qu'il existe des preuves suffisantes, donnant des motifs substantiels de croire que M. Yekatom Ngaïsola ont bien commis les crimes qui leur sont imputés, sous le chef d'accusation 29, et demandent respectueusement à la Chambre de confirmer les charges respectives. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Maître. Je vous félicite également pour votre concision. Et maintenant, je vois Maître Massida debout. Je pense que c'est son tour. Maître.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voulais, avec l'indulgence de la Chambre, suggérer, si possible, de prendre la pause maintenant. Je suis prêt à enchaîner, mais mes propos dureront plus ou moins 30 minutes. Et si possible, je souhaiterais continuer mes propos dans la même session. Si c'est bien pour la Chambre, on pourrait peut-être prendre la pause maintenant et recommencer à 11h15. Si la Chambre ne considère pas que c'est bien de faire la pause maintenant, je peux enchaîner sans problème. Je vous remercie de votre patience.
Maître, la Chambre s'est brièvement consultée et est d'accord à ce qu'on prenne la pause maintenant. Alors,
je vous remercie.
Voilà. Madame la greffière, nous allons donc suspendre l'audience. nous allons suspendre l'audience pour 30 minutes. Nous reprenons à 11h15. C'est ça.
All rise, pouvez-vous lever?